Invest criteria. How important are they? Well, in this video I'm going to run down what I think the appropriate ordering of importance for each of the items on the invest criteria is when you are crafting user stories. First of all though, if you find this content interesting, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. But with that, we should start talking about what invest criteria are. So invest criteria are a set of recommendations as to how to craft good user stories for your team. It is not a definition of what a user story is. It is simply a recommendation on how to write them very well. To that end though, because of team specifics, product specifics, you are going to find that some of these criteria are more important and more generally applicable than others. Now you might also notice that the SMART criteria are very similar to the INVEST criteria, in that the SMART criteria, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound, are very, very similar to the INVEST criteria. And that is not a coincidence. The INVEST criteria are based loosely on the SMART criteria for a goal, because user stories are a goal that the team sets themselves to deliver. With that though, let's jump straight in and I'm going to start my rundown, starting with valuable. Now, does a story have to be valuable? Well, ideally, yes. I mean, that's pretty self-evident, actually, I think. If you're splitting your production down and the increments that you're building aren't valuable, then you have to wonder, why are you even doing that, right? So valuable, that's 8 out of 10 in my book. You want to be delivering value, and you want to be delivering value in an incremental way. Very uncontroversial. 8 out of 10. Okay, the others are certainly not going to be as straightforward as that one. Next up, estimable. How important is it for work to be able to be sized? Well, you definitely need to know that it fits in sprint. Let me ask you this. What weighs more, an elephant or a giraffe? Now, how much does an elephant weigh? Is it important to know exactly how long a user story will take to complete? Does it matter if it's going to take 1 day or 2 days? Does it matter if it's going to take 4 days or 5 days? Here's a question. Why do we use story points at all? I would argue that yes, you need to know whether a user story fits in sprint, because that's what you're committing to deliver. And you need to know the relative sizes of stories to a first order approximation. But the very fact that story points exist, and in general you don't estimate things in hours, you estimate things in story points, means that clearly needing to be accurately estimable is not a big priority for user stories when you're writing them. So this one's going to be somewhere in the middle. You need them to be somewhat estimable. You do not need them to be estimable accurately. 5 out of 10. Independence! How independent do stories really need to be? Well, ideally, of course, you do want stories to be independent because you don't want your backlog to constantly have to shift around. You should be able to move stories up and down the stack rank of your backlog without having to worry about their interdependencies with each other. If you have a huge number of interdependencies between all of your stories, keeping your backlog in a manageable state is going to be a nightmare. On the other hand, you cannot create data for a database before you have created the database that the data you're creating for that database can be created. Now I know that user stories are supposed to be a vertical slice of functionality. In fact, some people have V as being vertical rather than valuable, which kind of pulls into question whether valuable is actually really that valuable, considering that some versions of the acronym use something else to be the V. But if you're trying to make a vertical slice of functionality with every story that you do, you're going to be reneging on your commitment to producing stories that are small. And small is literally the S later in this acronym. So is it really a problem if two stories depend on one another? If you can't deliver an entire vertical slice of functionality in one sprint, is that an issue? I argue no. And for that reason, independent gets a 3 out of 10. Okay, next up, testable. Do stories have to always be testable? Well, let me put it this way. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, does it make a sound? Okay. If a developer writes code and there's no way of testing whether that code was ever written, was that code ever written? I hope you see what I'm getting at. If you have no way of testing whether a bug is fixed, or you have no way of testing whether a feature was even developed, why are you doing it? Now, there are some strange edge cases that can exist in the real world for this one, right? There might be a 1 in 1,000 time event that it's just not practicable to write test cases for, but you want to do a minor code refactor to make sure that that edge case never applies. Or maybe there are security issues, meaning that you can't test in a way that you would want to test because it would expose some other kind of vulnerability in a live server or something along those lines. But aside from very, very unusual edge cases, everything you put into that backlog, everything you commit to deliver in a sprint, should be testable. So bam, 9 out of 10, except for exceptional cases, everything needs to be testable. Okay, here's the one that I'm really going to get roasted for in the comments, and if you really disagree with me on this one, please do let me know in the comments, but I'm going to go with negotiable being not important. Now, negotiable essentially is saying that the work that you commit to delivering is not a contract for delivery, i.e. you're able to make interpretations, and the way a story is written should be able to be open to discussion. In my experience, this is actually a bit of a trap and will lead to scope creep. As far as my experience goes, and the teams that I have worked with, the best way to ensure that you are delivering what you set out to deliver is actually to make user stories as specific as possible. In fact, you might notice that the negotiable point in the invest criteria is essentially entirely at odds with the specific point from the smart criteria. Make of that what you will. Now, when they're in the draft phase, when you are in the process of grooming your stories, yes, you want to have that discussion. You want to do that double diamond design philosophy. You want to be opening up drafts and you want to be refining your stories as you go. But once you commit a story to a sprint, once you're actually delivering it, the team have given you an estimate, which means they're happy with what you've written as those acceptance criteria for that story. By that point, it should be pretty well crystallized what you're going to be delivering that sprint, because if not, how do you know whether you've delivered it in sprint or not? If what's in the user story is vague or open to interpretation, you can't know that that's what you actually delivered. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I actually disagree with negotiable being even a feature of a well-written user story. I think you should negotiate the user story during the grooming process, but once you're committing to deliver it, it should be crystallized. So 1 out of 10. Finally, small. Small is absolutely critical. Small, spoiler warning, it's 10 out of 10, right? If your stories aren't small, you are not going to be able to deliver them in sprint, right? Getting things done, getting things delivered is the absolute most important thing when you are delivering user stories. If you're writing user stories, you need to make them deliverable. Long user stories represent a larger investment from the company in work in progress. And if you've ever read anything like the DevOps Handbook, you will know how much of a killer work in progress is. You need to minimize work in progress, make your stories as small as possible. You are delivering incremental value every sprint, and you need to make sure that the work you're doing is being delivered within that sprint. Long user stories overrun. Overrunning user stories give you higher volatility on your velocity. Higher volatility on your velocity means that you do not know what you can deliver in sprint anymore. And if you don't know what you can deliver in sprint, you cannot plan a sprint effectively. And this is why small user stories are absolutely key. 10 out of 10, you never want to see big user stories. Okay, and that's going to wrap it up for my list. So in order, it should be here right now. Let me know what you think of these rankings, but before I go, let me just say one last thing. You can feel free to totally ignore my ranking. Agile is a team-centric process. This is how I regard the importance of these based on the teams that I have worked with. When you go and work with a team, it is the team that decides what stories are allowed in sprint and what stories are not allowed in sprint, and they will let you know if they think that this list should be in a different order. It's the team that agrees what they're going to deliver for sprint, and if you don't write your stories to the team's liking, they will let you know. And teams should spend time in their retros and in their other meetings discussing with themselves the quality of the user stories that they have been taking into sprint and how these can be improved. So be nice to your BA, give them feedback on their user stories. With that, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. If your name is David, because you specifically asked me to remind you, hit the bell icon as well so that you get notifications. Please consider sharing with a friend, and otherwise, thank you very much for your attention, and as ever, we'll talk soon.